Are you curious about the way wine has been intertwined with politics around the world? Did you know that a bottle engraved with Thomas Jefferson's initials became the center of a huge wine scandal in 1985? What does pulling a Nixon mean? And how are John F. Kennedy and James Bond connected through a bottle of wine? Well, you're going to discover all of that tonight through the stories my wonderful guest here is going to share with you tonight. I'm going to introduce him momentarily. But first, if you're watching this on the replay, please in the comments type the word replay because I want to know, did you catch this on the recording? And what's the greatest bottle you've tried lately? Of course, if you're here with me live, type in where you're logging in from, what's in your glass, or what you've enjoyed. All right, I'm Natalie McLean and I offer popular online wine and food pairing courses at nataliemclean.com, and you've just joined the most passionate group of wine lovers who meet every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube to talk to the most interesting people in the world of wine. Now, before I get to our guest, I want to hear from you, so let us know if you have any questions we're not answering, what are your favorite tips, and bonus, before I introduce Fred Ryan, I want to say that one of you is going to get this gorgeous book that he's produced, written, and researched. If you choose your favorite social media channel and post about a wine that you've enjoyed lately and tag me, and you'll get a personally signed copy of this book that we're going to talk about tonight. So get busy on that after you watch this. All right, so back to our guest. Fred Ryan is the publisher and CEO of the Washington Post, and he's been an aficionado of both wine and White House history for decades. So he grew up in Italy and California, probably developed a natural interest in wine, and he studied winemaking and has even participated in a joint winemaking venture in Napa Valley. He served as Ronald Reagan's post-presidential chief of staff and currently serves as the chair of the board of directors for the White House Historical Association, the organization that published this gorgeous book. And he joins me now from Washington, D.C. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here with us, Fred.
Thank you, Natalie. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful. Well, I'm so impressed with the book. We're going to dive into that very soon. But first, let's talk more about what led you to this book. How did you become fascinated with presidential politics?
Well, I'd been interested in history. My family had been interested in politics, and as a student, my major actually was political science. So I had from my college days this deep interest in politics in particular, and you can't study politics without studying the presidency and the White House. So that led me to a specific interest in what happens in the White House, what's it like to be in there, and I eventually, as you mentioned, got the chance to work in there and see firsthand.
Right. Oh, that's fantastic. And so how many presidents have you met over your lifetime?
Well, I have been very fortunate because having worked in politics and then worked for former President Reagan, where he stayed in touch with presidents, and I'm in the media business now, so I have met actually most of the presidents in my lifetime. I think 10 presidents. So I've been very fortunate to be able to do that, and it gives a personal dimension because when I've met them, particularly interest in wine, either sometimes we've talked about wine, or I've wondered what their wine interests were, and that led me, as I was doing this book, to want to research a little bit about each of those presidents.
That's fantastic. And then now you have this dual interest in wine. I can see part of it might come from where you grew up, but how did you really get interested in wine as well?
Well, as you mentioned, I lived in Italy at the time. I was below the drinking age, but I did have a chance to try a little bit of Italian wine and learn a little bit about it and watch how it was made. Actually, our next door neighbors made wine. They grew grapes, they made wine, and I remember as a little kid, every day they would bring a jug of wine over and give it to my parents, and then they would come back at the end of the day and they'd want the empty bottle, and there'd be a big bottle. And they didn't quite consume as much as our Italian neighbors did, but then living in California at a time when the California wine industry was really taking off, so it was a chance to kind of see that firsthand and enjoy it as well.
Oh, wow. And what years were you in California? Was it back when Robert Mondavi was getting started, or what
Yes,
was?
this was I was in California from through the 70s to 90s
Oh, wow.
or to late 80s and watched the California wine business just take off and become national and then international with names as you mentioned, like Robert Mondavi and Turley and Warren Winiarski and so many people who were leaders in elevating California wine to the place it is in the world today.
Wow. That's, yeah, it's pivotal time for California wine, and they've never looked back. I mean, it's just,
Yes.
it's such an important wine category that we have here in Canada. Very, very popular. So let me just ask before, again, we get into the specifics. Do you think drinking wine is a political act?
Well, it certainly takes place in political environments. Sometimes, of course, during in official events where presidents participate, there's always the diplomatic aspects of the toasts. But in doing this book, I went back, and one of the biggest takeaways was how much of an interest that presidents and political figures, even in the earliest days of the United States, had in wine. And I found one comment, just for example, where our sixth president, Jefferson. I'm going to back up. Our sixth president, Jefferson being our number one president in terms of wine interest, but John Quincy Adams, our sixth president, criticized his political opponent, Henry Clay, by saying he had bad taste in wine.
What was he drinking, from boxed wine or something? What?
I'm not sure. I was interested to see what was John Quincy Adams drinking that was so much better than what Henry Clay was drinking.
Oh, that's hilarious. That's a great quote. So why do you think wine and politics are so intertwined? I mean, just they seem to be a natural fit, but what's your take on that?
I think a number of things have done it, have caused this. One, Jefferson, who I alluded to earlier, the third president of the United States, and he, as I've described him, as the founding father of wine in America. It was just one of his passions.
Yeah.
And he, having been in France as America's emissary in Paris, he traveled around the wine regions of France and Italy and took copious notes, and he purchased wines there. When he returned, he was so passionate about wine, he shared that passion with other American presidents, including George Washington, and then his successors. So I think just his passion kind of elevated wine into the American presidency. And then over the years, it became alcohol as it was popular or unpopular. It took on a political dimension. And then most recently, at the White House, when presidents welcome foreign visitors, they showcase the great things in America: great food, great entertainment, and great wine. And that is a statement of trying to elevating American products. So various ways it's kind of moved in and out of politics, but it seems to always be increasing, never going away.
Absolutely, and wine is such an important part of the culture, especially for those of us who love it, that I can imagine you'd want to showcase that to visiting dignitaries as much as you'd want to showcase, your musical talent and other things
Yes.
that, the country has to offer. So
Yes.
that's amazing. Let's go back to Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, as you mentioned. What was his quote? "No nation is drunk where wine is not dear," or something?
Where wine, yes. No, he made the quote where he was advocating a different tax on whiskey and wine. And his point was, we don't want people to go to whiskey because it's cheaper. And he was advocating that the tariffs be removed from wine and left on whiskey. So he made a comment that no nation is drunk when wine is freely available.
Ha, there. Well, I got to support that. He get my vote. Definitely get my vote. Now, he lived in, is it Monticello? Is that how you pronounce it? In Virginia?
Yes, Monticello.
Okay. And did he bring back vine cuttings from Bordeaux and try to plant them there? Or what was he doing with
He
wine?
did. Yes,
Okay.
his estate is in not too far from Washington, D.C., Monticello. And while he was in France, as I mentioned earlier, he was meticulous in learning about French wine, and he learned ways to bring it to the U.S. Prior to that time, the most popular wine in the United States was Madeira, and it was because it was a wine that could make the journey across the Atlantic with the rough seas and the heat and the hull of a boat. it could make that journey and sometimes even be better than when it left. But more delicate wines, now, the Madeira's fortified wine, more delicate wines couldn't make the journey the way it was done at that time. But Jefferson actually spent time, I found records where he found the best shipper who could do it with the minimum damage. And he found the company that would put it on the barrels on the wagons and could get the barrels to the port with both less breakage and also less thievery, I guess you want to call it, because some of these shippers would drink the wine as they were taking it to the port. But he perfected, or improved anyway, how the wines came. And then he offered a kind of his broad knowledge about different wines on different occasions. So while he was, and by the way, while he was in the White House, he designed the first White House wine cellar.
Oh,
There had been no wine cellars. George Washington, when he was president, never lived in the White House. He was our first president. Then the second president, Adams, lived there briefly, but it really wasn't finished when Jefferson, as you mentioned, was the third president, moved in. So Jefferson said, "Where's the wine cellar?" And there wasn't a wine cellar. So he built one right in the front of the White House. And you mentioned Monticello, his home. He built a replica of the one at the White House at his home in Monticello. And when he left office as president, he had an Italian winemaking friend who was into a family who still makes wine today. They're in their 26th generation of making wine in Tuscany. His name was Philip Mazzei, and Philip Mazzei brought the cuttings. They planted the cuttings, and they tried to grow the grapes, but unfortunately, at that time, they couldn't make the grapes to make a good quality wine. So Jefferson never got the chance to see wine grown in Virginia, but today, as you know, Virginia is really producing some spectacular wines.
Oh, yeah, and it's such a beautiful part of the country to visit, like on a wine vacation when we can get back to traveling further abroad.
Yes.
Yeah. So now Jefferson wrote a letter to that famous Bordeaux dessert wine house, Chateau Yquem in Bordeaux. Yeah, in Bordeaux. What was he doing? Why was he writing them?
Well, Natalie, one of the fascinating things in doing this book was I just kept coming across more information. As you mentioned, it's 456 pages long. And it weighs 5.5 pounds for those who want to do their bicep curls, like you are.
But it's so beautiful. I mean, the illustrations. But yeah, continue.
But I kept finding new material, and here I know the winemaker at Chateau Yquem, and I was telling him about doing this book, and he said, "Well, it's interesting because I have a letter sitting on my desk from Thomas Jefferson."
Wow.
And I said, "Well, tell me about this letter. I don't think anyone even knows of its existence." And on his desk, Chateau Yquem had been in the same family for well over 200 years. And Thomas Jefferson wrote to the family that owned Chateau Yquem, saying, this was in 1790, he said, a new American president, General Washington, is interested in wine, and I think he would enjoy tasting yours. Please send him 30 dozen bottles.
Oh my gosh.
And while you're at it, send me 10 dozen bottles too.
Why not? It's all the same ship.
Right. So here was this letter that's sitting on the desk, the original Thomas Jefferson letter, and they were kind enough to let me to duplicate it in the book. It's one of the many original Thomas Jefferson and other presidential documents that we were able to get access to and include in this book.
Oh, that's fantastic. But he sort of went for the top tier because, a bottle these days of Yquem would go for hundreds of dollars or whatever. So just send over 30, actually make that 50 cases while you're at it. It's all the same.
And another thing with Jefferson that I learned I didn't know was, of course, there's the famous 1855 classification of the wines, and that resulted in the premier cru and and all. And of the 5 wines in the first growths from 1855, and as you know, there were only 4, and then Mouton was elevated later.
Right.
But of the 4 that were in there, Thomas Jefferson, 60 years earlier than 1855, had given his own review of the wines of Bordeaux, and he'd ranked them the same way. So
Really?
he actually was decades ahead of the 1855 classification.
That is so impressive. So he had quite the palate. He wasn't just a fan of wine. He really knew what he was talking about.
Yes, he could discern quality.
Wow. Yeah, and he went right for it. Like, don't bother sending me your plunk. Just over here, Chateau Yquem. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to show some pictures because some of them are related to Jefferson. So let me just choose the correct window here. First, I'm going to start with your book. So let me know if you see this on the screen, Fred.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Let me expand
And you
a
know,
bit. Yeah.
while you're setting that up, I can tell you that the goal on the cover of the book, I spent a lot of time on it, was I wanted to put you in the seat of the President of the United States while wine is being enjoyed. And this is a composite picture. It was taken from an actual state dinner that took place during the Trump administration for the Prime Minister of Australia. And we added various elements, including the decanter that you see right in front. That is the actual decanter of our fourth president, Madison. And you can see how ornate it is. It has this extensive engraving and seals and eagles and all. And that's actually in the White House collection. So we added that. And then another thing you'll notice is, I know as you and your wine aficionado listeners note, there's a little bit of a violation of normal procedure that every wine glass is filled. The red and the white and the champagne, they're all filled at once, which typically at a state dinner, they're filled with each course. But we wanted just to give the full wine experience. So it was designed in that way, but it's meant to let you feel as though you are the President of the United States and you are enjoying wine at the White House.
Lovely. I love the setting. And yes, it is from the perspective of sitting at the president's seat. Wow, that's great. Very creative.
Thank you.
All right. So this is Jefferson's handwriting, is it not?
Yes.
Okay.
Jefferson kept a detailed list of every wine that he served while he was president.
Wow.
And you can see, as you provided on this, the dates, the specific dates, what was served, how much of it was served, and he ranging from Madeira to the Rhines of Rhone to different, all the different wines that he served, and the volume that was served each occasion. It's a phenomenal historic record to show you how much attention a president of the United States would spend on the wines that he was serving to his guests at the White House.
Oh, he's so meticulous. I'm surprised he had time for writing policy in that. Well, then again, he
Yes.
drafted the Constitution, so I guess he was a man of many talents.
Yes.
So let's look at this. Oh, this is next related to Jefferson. I alluded to it in my intro. Now, tell us about this bottle that has, well, tell us what's engraved on this bottle.
Yes, it's a very old shaped bottle from that period, and it has the date 1787 Lafitte, all engraved on the side. There's no paper label, of course, and then at the bottom it has TJ. And that bottle had a very interesting history. In the mid 80s, as you may recall, this collection of undiscovered rare wines was made by a fellow over in Paris, and he indicated that he was doing some construction work on his house and knocked out a wall, and behind the wall were these bottles of Lafitte and other top wines from the 18th century. And this one particularly had TJ on the side, Lafitte, and it turned out that was the same year that Thomas Jefferson was there, and it was known that he enjoyed Lafitte, and he would use the initials TJ. So this wine was reviewed by all the experts. It went to auction, and Malcolm Forbes, great American publisher, and his son, Kip Forbes, also tremendous wine enthusiast and a great business person, decided they wanted to buy this bottle of wine. And it had been certified as original by Christie's, and an auction was taking place in London. So the Forbes had a museum in New York that they wanted to put it on display. So Kip Forbes flew to London. He bid on this. The bidding went back and forth, got out of hand. In the end, he paid $155,000 for this single bottle of wine.
Wow.
He put it on his private plane. He flew it back to New York, put it on display in the museum, and unfortunately, the curatorial staff in the museum had really not considered the delicacy of the item they were displaying. And after it had been on display for a while, the cork loosened and sunk inside the bottle, and the contents were destroyed.
Oh,
So it was a very expensive investment that was lost. And then to compound things, another wine collector had purchased some bottles that were believed to have been from Thomas Jefferson, and he wasn't sure. So
okay.
he hired a team, including former FBI forensic agents, to track the bottle and to find out what was happening. And it turned out they discovered that the engraving was not done by hand, it was done by a power tool. And no power tools existed, of course, in the 18th century,
Right.
um, and that the bottles were fake,
Oh
and
dear.
that the other bottles as well were fake. And that word got back to Malcolm Forbes. So he had a great line. He just dismissed the whole thing, and he said, "I just wish Thomas Jefferson had drank the damn bottle."
I'll bet he did. Oh my gosh, that's a great story. Oh my gosh. Is that one of those bottles? Is that the basis for the book Billionaire's Vinegar?
Yes, exactly
Okay.
right.
Okay.
Billionaire's Vinegar talks about this bottle and the other ones that a fellow named Koch from Florida, who was an incredible wine collector, who had purchased a number of these bottles, and he was determined to get to the truth. And he's the one who hired the experts to trace this and get to a final decision on it.
Well, if you have the means to buy the wine, I'm sure you have the means to investigate it. So
Yes,
good
yes.
on him. All right. Well, let's keep going to the seventh president of the United States, Andrew Jackson. Tell us about the inauguration and his love for wine.
Well, Jackson was considered a kind of a frontier common man. That was kind of a term that was used to describe him. And he decided that he wanted to have an open inauguration. So they basically just opened the gates to the White House, opened the doors to the White House, and let anybody come who wanted to. And it turned into a drunken brawl. People were jammed in the place. They were pulling drawers out to see what was in there. They were crawling in and out of the windows. It was an absolute mess, and it was out of control. And smartly, the staff in the White House decided the only way to end it was to take the alcohol out of the White House where it's being served and put it in the front lawn, and that would move the
Right.
crowd outside because they wanted to drink more. So they
Yeah.
finally were able to get things under control by moving the wine outside and the alcohol outside so the crowd could drink it there. But despite his reputation as a common frontier man, Jackson was a ranked pretty high when it came to the presidents and the amount of wine they served and the quality of wine they served. He made sure his guests were, after the inaugural, were well entertained.
Well, as he himself was. Did he die of gout?
Yes, yes. Several of the presidents died of gout and cirrhosis of the liver, so they may have been indulging a little bit too much in alcohol at the time.
Very dedicated to making sure everyone had a good time at the White House.
Yes.
Now we get the opposite extreme with Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th president, 1877 to 1881. What was he and what was his wife? His wife had a nickname.
Yes. Well, I think a lot of us know that Prohibition took place in the United States, and that was 1920 to 1933, where the Constitution outlawed alcohol. But before that, there was a movement called the Temperance Movement, and it was kind of somewhat religious driven, and it wove in and out of politics in different regions of the country. But the temperance movement gained strength at different periods. And Rutherford B. Hayes was president during a time when the temperance movement was strong, and his wife, Lucy Hayes, was one of the temperance leaders. And they had a dilemma because at the beginning of his administration, in 1877, there was a very important state visit that was coming to the White House. It was the son of the Russian Tsar, who at that time, that was a very important relationship to the United States. And the diplomats were saying, of course, you must serve alcohol. This is a visiting head of state. It will be a faux pas if we did not. And she was hesitant, but the Hayeses finally relented, and they allowed the alcohol to be served. It was the only time during the entire presidency for 4 years that alcohol was allowed in the White House. And Mrs. Hayes, Lucy Hayes, took this beautiful glassware that we were talking about earlier, these decanters and beautiful glasses, and she used them only for the service of fruit juice. So she was given the nickname Lemonade Lucy because of her fruit juice that she served at the White House.
Oh, wow. Wow, that would be no fun. But anyway,
Right.
there you go. You have all types, this whole range. is just amazing in terms of the presidents and their relationships to wine. Now, President Woodrow Wilson, what did he do? The Volstead Act was the one that enacted prohibition, but what did he do on the first, I guess, reading, if you would call it, of the Volstead Act?
Yes,
What was his approach?
that's as we were talking about a moment ago. That's when Prohibition officially began, which was a constitutional amendment was passed, and then the Volstead Act was the legislation that was meant to implement it,
Okay.
and it banned the sale, transport, or production of alcohol. And Woodrow Wilson was president, and he vetoed it, which American presidents can do. Congress passes a law, and they veto it, and that means I'm rejecting this law. And then, but the Congress has the power to override the veto, meaning 2/3 of Congress must vote to override. And Congress felt so strong about this, they overrode his veto. So
Wow.
the Volstead Act passed, and he actually had an interesting experience. He was a wine enthusiast himself, and he had a impressive cellar that he'd accumulated and had with him while he was president. And when he left the White House in 1921, the end of his term, he wanted to take his wine with him, his wine cellar. And under the Volstead Act, it was against the law to transport wine, even to his new house in Washington, D.C. So he had to get specific regulatory approval for him to take his wine out of the White House and drive it about 3 or 4 miles away to the new home that he was going to live in Washington, D.C.
Dedicated. That's
Yes.
great. And did he say something about the French in relation to wine at the Versailles Treaty?
Yes, he was. As you know, the Treaty of Versailles was the end of World War I, and Woodrow Wilson was in Paris for the signing of the treaty. And after they signed the treaty, the Prime Minister of France pulled him aside and handed him a glass of French wine, and he said, I hope you enjoy this wine, because when you get home, you will not be able to have any wine. So Woodrow Wilson, I think, thoroughly enjoyed that glass of wine before he got back to the United States.
I'll bet he savored it. All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen again because we're going to talk about President Franklin D. Roosevelt and how he prepared to entertain British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who's quite a character, of course. Loved his wine and all types. But tell us about that.
Well, the Prohibition, just continuing with that theme, ended under Roosevelt's administration. In fact, he signed the law ending Prohibition, and his famous words afterwards was, "This feels like a good time for a beer." And he had a drink to celebrate it, but he invited, of course, Winston Churchill, his counterpart, Prime Minister of England, to the United States. And Churchill was known for his enjoyment and consumption of alcohol. And I was able, in doing the research, to find the instructions that the White House wait staff had during the time that Churchill was visiting Roosevelt. And it said, for breakfast, be sure there's plenty of sherry. For lunchtime, wine and brandy. And for dinner, scotch and champagne. So
Wow.
he certainly drank well while he was at the White House.
Prodigious appetite. What did Churchill say about a magnum of wine at lunch or something?
Just, Natalie, it's one of my favorite quotes. One thing, as you noticed in the book, just to add another dimension to it, I've taken on almost every page, there's a short 2-sentence, 3-sentence quote or blurb, something that someone, a president or someone famous has said about wine. There's one right there, yes. And I love the one by Churchill. He said, a magnum, which you know is a double-sized bottle of wine, he said, a magnum of claret is the perfect size for 2 gentlemen to enjoy over lunch, especially if one is not drinking.
Gotta love him.
Right.
I forget which dinner he was at, but he was sitting beside someone. This is a old story, old chestnut, but he was sitting beside a lady who said, "Sir, you are drunk." And what, do you remember that one? And then,
Yes, he said, this woman was apparently quite critical of him, and she said, "You are drunk. You are an embarrassment. You are drunk." And he said, "Madam, I am drunk now, but I'll be sober tomorrow. You are ugly tonight, and you will be ugly tomorrow."
Back at you. Wow. What a wit. President Harry Truman, 1945. Now, we were talking about how generously the wine flowed in for many presidents, but what was Harry Truman's style?
Well, Harry Truman, came into the presidency shortly. He followed Roosevelt when Roosevelt died in office, and of course that was just following Prohibition. And the United States had moved away from being a wine enjoying country because two things had happened. One was Prohibition had wiped out most of the wine producers in the United States. The only ones that stayed in business were the ones that could claim they were doing it for religious purposes. And if that's true, I can tell you a lot of monks and nuns and priests must have been drinking a lot of wine because there was still a lot being produced. But that was one. And then secondly, during the war, there was really no importation of wines from Europe or anywhere else. So America had essentially become a cocktail nation. That's when cocktails were in their prime. And Truman, allowed wine to be served in moderation. He didn't have a lot of it. It wasn't so central to his presidency, so he would serve wine, but he would just make sure they were a little slow in refilling your glass. So guests at the Truman White House were not overly indulging in wine.
Wow, should have paired him up with Lemonade Lucy. Sounds like a no fun party. I'm going to screen share again just to jump back because we've got a few beautiful settings here of entertaining. This is Roosevelt's dining room, I believe, all set up for a special event. It hasn't shared yet. There we go. There we go. That's why you can't see it. All right. This is, I believe, Roosevelt's.
This was,
setting.
Theodore Roosevelt, the first Roosevelt, our 25th president. And you can tell that entertaining was quite elaborate then. And this was quite a big banquet. And if you look closely, you'll see multiple glasses, at least 4 in front of each person. Roosevelt was one who did serve wine at the White House. He was not. He was one of he's viewed as they call him the Rough Rider, kind of a brave explorer, driven man of bigger than life proportions. But one thing I found was his alcohol consumption was not necessarily bigger than life. But he had a daughter who was, while he was in the White House, one that was married and one that had her debutante party. And in the course of my research, I found the notes where it was clear by the wait staff that a lot of wine had been served at both of those occasions.
Did someone come out as a debutante when they were 16, or was it older?
I'm not sure what the age was. His daughter, while he was president, though, they decided to just take over the White House and let her invite all of her friends over for a dance and an overnight party, and the wine flowed freely through that.
Why not? Birthday parties, may as well live it up while you're there. Now, this is Eisenhower's state dinner setting.
Yes, and this is, of course, the White House had been renovated. A lot of people, when you talk about the White House now, it was built more than 200 years ago. It's burned, rebuilt, and I learned an interesting thing, by the way, when it was burned. Thomas Jefferson had been president. He was the third president. It was burned during our fourth president, Madison. And we all learned in school about how there's this famous portrait of George Washington, and Dolly Madison, the president's wife, said, "Save that portrait." And the staff took it off the wall, and even though the White House burned, that portrait was saved, and it's back on the wall in the White House today. Wow. But I was wondering, okay, we know about the portrait. When the British burned the White House, it was in 1814. I want to know what happened to the wine that was in this wine cellar that Thomas Jefferson had built. Well, it turns out the British burned the White House, and then they left to the Capitol building to burn the Capitol. While they were up burning the Capitol, the American soldiers arrived at the White House, and they discovered this wine cellar. A White House burned to the ground, but there's this wine cellar with all these bottles in it. So the American soldiers drank the wine. They drank the wine that was in the White House wine cellar. But with the image you have now, the White House was rebuilt again in 1952, and that's the new design of the East Room of the White House, the State Dining Room of the White House that you're showing here, and set up for a state dinner.